I want to welcome you also on behalf of the three co-sponsoring organizations that bring you these events. The first one is the Judson Memorial Church, that's where you're sitting, that provides this space and a lot of encouragement, and some of whose parishioners are here with us this evening. The second is the Left Forum. That's the organization that is now becoming quite famous for producing those annual conferences, usually towards the end of May, as we had this last year at John Jay School at CUNY, assembles about 4,000 or 5,000 activists and scholars on the left every year. And finally, Democracy at Work. That's the organization that I work with and that produces these events. So all three of those collaborate to produce this. As I have said on other occasions, I want to address a comment to those who see this around the world, and we do have an awful lot of people who look at it across the world, that everybody sitting here has paid their $10 to get in here to help defray the costs. So if you're getting the benefit of watching at your leisure, in your home or your workplace, on the internet, please hit that donate button and send us the $10 that would make it what you can contribute, since the cost of sending you this video is a major part of the cost we have. The people here shouldn't carry for everybody. So please, those of you watching, help us in that way. Needless to say, anyone who has a great deal of extra money and looking for a place to get rid of it, Democracy at Work is a 501c3 organization, which means any funds you give to this group are fully tax deductible, given that we are an educational institution, as sure you can see. I would also like to draw your attention to our website, democracyatwork.info. It has been completely redesigned, and that redesign was launched over the last week or so. So I urge you to take a look at it. There are ways for you to sign up for a free newsletter, as well as take advantage of the enormous amount of material we're constantly putting up there. Access to the website is completely free, and you can do it 24/7 whenever it's convenient for all of you. And finally, I was asked to make an announcement about the radio program we produce, because some of you may not be aware of it. This is a monthly event, the second Wednesday of every month. So we're meeting on the 12th of August, and we'll meet again on the 9th of September, which is the second Wednesday of that month. But I also do a weekly radio program. It began in March of 2011 with WBAI here in New York City. And every week, it's now here at WBAI, Fridays at 9 in the morning, immediately after Amy Goodman's program. But we are now also broadcast regularly on 46 or 47 other stations around the United States, including Los Angeles, Houston, Tampa, San Francisco, Sacramento, Peoria, Illinois, and on and on and on. Anyone who is connected in any way to a radio station that might be interested in this program, please let us know. We have people who will follow up, talk to the radio station, station managers, and so on. We now know, because we've learned it over 3 years, that the audience for what we're trying to do, and I do in this weekly program something not so different from what I do here on a monthly basis, that the audience for this is literally enormous. We estimate that we get into, with the various ways that we produce this radio show, into between 750,000 and 1 million homes and offices in the United States now. Truth Out, some of you know that service, Truth Out sends out every week's program towards the end of the week, Fridays or Saturday. If you subscribe to Truth Out, you can get it that way as well. So any of you who have any thoughts or ideas about radio exposure, please share them with us. You can reach us through the website. The website, in addition to having all these materials for you, allows you to communicate with us directly. There's an email connection to do that, sending suggestions, follow-ups, criticisms, whatever. We welcome it all, and we read it all. And also the websites allow you, by clicking on an icon, to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, sign up for our free newsletter, and that way we'll be in touch with you on a more regular basis. Okay, let's then turn, as we usually do, to some of the things that happened in the recent few weeks, and then to the basic topics that we're going to talk about. The first, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, not because it isn't worth it, but because we have spent so much time, and we will in the future again. But another milestone, or maybe it should be called a millstone, we'll see, was passed this week in Greece. Basically, in the Greek parliament is, at this moment, I believe, voting, or it will very shortly vote, on the next installment of this truly awesome and horrible austerity that is being imposed on the Greeks with a vengeance that is remarkable to see, led above all by the government of Angela Merkel in Germany, with the more or less grudging approval of most of the other leaders in Europe. The basic condition is to give Greece a third bailout. Again, I won't go over the details. The bulk of the first two bailouts of Greece really shouldn't be called bailout of Greece, because they weren't. What they were was the following, and nothing is more important than to get this across. Greece, starting when the crisis hit, say around 2008 or 9, owed a lot of money to private creditors, mostly the Greek private banks, German private banks, and French private banks. Others too, but those were the big three lenders. When the crisis hit around the whole world, our country, Europe, etc., this little country of Greece was particularly badly hit, mainly because it depends more on tourism and shipping than on anything else. Those are the two industries where they have a prominent place. The economic crisis decimated shipping because nobody was trading with anybody anymore, and no one needed a big ship to carry what wasn't being bought and sold anyway. And tourism dried up because everybody was unemployed, everybody was terribly afraid of their economic situation. They weren't about to go to those lovely Greek islands and spend a lot of money because that was no longer a smart move, to say the least. So the Greek economy, like many, kind of collapsed, and suddenly the Greeks couldn't possibly pay those debts. It's a little bit like the money that was lent in this country to what we call subprime mortgage holders, people who bought a house or expanded a house, borrowed money to do it. Just like in the United States where the banks pushed these loans on people, in Europe, the French and German and Greek banks pushed loans on the Greek government because it was very profitable to do that. And everybody just thought, the way they always do, that it was up and onward, and so you could lend forever and it wouldn't be a problem. Well, the Greeks announced to everybody, well, now it's a problem. Just like millions of Americans announced they couldn't pay their mortgages, it's a problem, and you have to work that out. Here was the difficulty. If the Greeks had not paid, if they had defaulted, if they had simply said, we can't pay, we won't pay, end of story, it would have plunged Greek, French, and German banks, private banks, into another crisis. They had already had a crisis in 2008 and 9 when the big global crisis hit, and they had gone to their respective governments and they'd gotten bailouts. German banks had gotten bailed out by Angela Merkel. French banks had gotten bailed out by Nicolas Sarkozy, the head of the French government at that time. And it cost these leaders tremendous political losses because the people there, something wants to struggle with my head. Yes, right, it must be something. Don't like the argument or something. The problem was that these leaders, Merkel and Sarkozy above all, did not want the Greeks to default because they would have had to go back to their leaders, Merkel and Sarkozy, to get another bailout. And that would have been the end of the political careers of Angela Merkel and Mr. Sarkozy. Mr. Sarkozy was bounced anyway because he had lost so much support that he was swept out of office by the French Socialist Party at that time. And Merkel was terribly afraid that the same was in store for her. So Merkel and the others engineered a very clever move. Here's what it was. They would get the European Central Bank, that's like the Federal Reserve for Europe, and the European Commission, the Community of United Countries, and the International Monetary Fund to lend a ton of money to Greece, which was called the bailout of Greece, giving the Greeks a ton of money because they were suffering in the crisis. But the credit had a proviso. You must use this money to pay back your private creditors. So the European institutions lent the money to Athens, which turned around and sent the money right back into the European countries from which it had come. The private banks now were paid back. They have no more, as it said in banking, no more skin in the game. No, they didn't care. Now Greece owed money to the institutions, IMF, European Central Bank, and the European Union. Okay? So nobody helped Greece get back on its feet. The money wasn't used for that. The money was used to pay off the private debts, and then Mrs. Merkel, and she really led everybody here, went to her people and said, the German people, listen, you should support me. I have helped a fellow European country, and I'm going to make sure that they don't do this to us again. And that way, you, the German people, won't have to pay the taxes into the European Union that will be used to deal with it if they don't pay back. We cannot let them not pay back. She portrayed herself as the rescuer of the German people, the protector of the... She will make sure they won't be taxed to help Greece. Greece has been helped enough. Clever. Greece has been helped. No. German banks were helped. That she couldn't say because that would have made her hated in that country. So she said, we've helped the Greeks, but it's enough, and I won't let them go after you. The thing to understand, and the way an American can understand it, what Mrs. Merkel did is successfully pull off what Mitt Romney tried and failed to pull off here. Remember Mitt Romney, May of 2012, gets caught in a little secret tape at a fundraiser meeting where he explains to his rich Republican fundraisers, remember, 47% of Americans, his number, 47% are lazy bums who live off government handouts. You know, Social Security, unemployment compensation, food stamp, the usual. And those 47 will never reach, he says to his rich Republican contributors. They always vote Democratic because they don't want to lose the government handouts they live on. But I, says Mitt Romney, represent the 53%, the rest of the population. We're the ones who work hard and we pay the taxes that are then used to sustain those lazy bums. That's what he said. All Republicans, sooner or later, either get caught or they don't, but this, and by the way, conservative Democrats, same game. And we also know, right, depending on which part of the country is, the lazy bum can become a non-white person, that's convenient. Or maybe the lazy bum is an immigrant, that's convenient. You adjust the message to whoever you think you can get on board with this kind of talk. It is fundamentally divisive of a society in a bitter way. And the scars last a long time. Romney tried it, but it didn't work here. Merkel tried it. Worked like a charm. Why? Because they're not a unified country yet. It's a little easier there because she could pit Germans, the people she depends on for votes, against Southern Europeans, Greeks, Italians, Portuguese. By the way, people with a bit of a darker skin, don't they? For a country like Germany to play that game, given its history, whoa. There's an example of a self-serving politician risking unspeakable historical and social consequences to get herself through a difficult political time for her. But no money went to rebuild the Greek economy. And in the current crush, Mrs. Merkel continues to play the same role. She is the champion for the German people. We will not have to pay any more taxes because we're going to make those Greek people suffer. And how? By making them take huge amounts of money inside Greece that they might have used to rebuild their broken economy, and instead they're going to have to use it to pay off their debts to Europe. So money will not be given to pensioners. Instead, it will pay off the European institutions. It will not be used to fix the roads. A $50 billion, that's part of what they're working on tonight, a $50 billion privatization fund. You know what that means? That's taking public assets owned by the Greek government, the water system, coastline, and selling it to private interests and using the money to pay off your creditors. So the Greek economy is in horrific shape, getting worse by the week, and absolutely nothing is being done about this. It's in fact being made worse. And that's the way the political struggles between one part of Europe, doing pretty well, Germany, a little bit France, a little bit Scandinavia, are toughing it against not just the Greeks, Spanish, Portuguese, Irish, Italians, Hungarians, and others. The probability of Europe uniting, which they've been working on for 35 years, to produce a United States of Europe comparable to the United States of America, that has been set back in a way no one knows whether it can even be overcome, given the hostility. Greeks hang Mrs. Merkel in effigy from lampposts on the street. The rage and the anger is beyond words. And whatever deals are made by Greek politicians, the Greek businessmen and women, the Greek working people, they are dead against all of this, and they are not quietly going to roll over. Not the Greeks. They have a long history of fighting, and they're going to be fighting a long time. So we will have many more opportunities. Each time you hear that it's finally been wound up in Greece, not at all. This is just another chapter, but in a very scary proposition. In fact, a sub-theme for tonight is beware of what you see happening over there. Because if the people who run the society are willing to do it over there, it's only a matter of time when they do it here too. And indeed, you're going to see later a concrete example of that. All right, next item. This last week, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal. Now, normally, I wouldn't bring that to your attention. There are many reasons for that, but this is a polite room, so I'll stay within the bounds of politeness. The story had to do with a press release given out by Wendy's. Wendy's is not the neighborhood lady you know. Wendy's, the hamburger chain. And Wendy's took the opportunity this last week to explain that they're very disappointed that around the country there is a movement to raise the minimum wage. President Obama has said he wants it at $10.10, but there's a movement to get it $15 minimum. That's passed in New York for fast food workers and in various other cities around the country, and there's clearly a movement to raise the minimum wage. And Wendy's just wants you to know, going to say the word Wendy's repeatedly. Wendy's wants you to know they're against it, in case you wondered why. I'll give you a hint. They hire a lot of fast food workers. That's who's making your hamburger when you go to Wendy's, if you do that. So Wendy's is explaining the effort to raise the minimum wage is an evil, ready, it's very important, is an evil plot that hurts poor people. Why? What? You know, to come up with that, and your laughter indicates you understand it real well, it's a stretch. Now you're going to hear the argument that they had to stretch to make this plausible. Here's how it goes. When the minimum wage is raised, Wendy's explains to us, in a tone that treats us as though we are maybe, I don't know, in the third grade and having trouble making it to the fourth. You see the higher price of a worker now, you got to pay that man or woman $15 to flip your hamburger. Now we're going to reduce the hours. You know, we can't pay you because if you cost us more per hour, we're going to give you fewer hours. Or maybe we'll get a machine that does what you do that we wouldn't have gotten before when we could pay you $8 or $9 an hour, but now we have to give you 15. So this isn't going to help poor people. And Wendy's, long known for its deep commitment to helping poor people, is concerned on behalf of the poor people who think they're going to be helped by a rising minimum wage, but will in fact be hurt. They probably spent a lot of money hiring economists like me to come up with that sort of story. But because it is repeated by so many and so many levels in the country, I wanted to talk to you just briefly about this. So let's do it in a rational, reasonable way. We are not employers, or for that matter, employees, and we can afford to look at it as it is. Okay, the minimum wage in the United States, $7.25. That's the federal one by the United States government. So that's a floor. You can't pay less than that. Many states around the country long ago decided that that's outrageous. $7.25, you know, that's the gross amount. Out of that, they have your withholding and your taxes, so you don't even see that. So you're talking $4 or $5 an hour is what you're actually going to get in this day and age. I'm here standing in New York City. I mean, you try to imagine how you're going to live like that. Okay, so many states have raised it. So it's higher in many states, but the federal is still $7.25, which is extraordinary, since in most industrial countries, it's much higher than that. We are really unusual in advanced industrial countries for how low our minimum wage is. Okay, so we have this minimum wage. And so the question is, what happens if you raise it? If you take it from $7.25 and make it 10 or 12 or 15 or any number that you want. Let's go through it. 1, is it possible that there will be employers somewhere who are so close to the edge of going out of business that if they actually had to pay their 5 or 10 or 20 or however many workers they have, $15 instead of $8, they go out of business? Yes. Sure, there are always some businesses that close to the tipping point that this kind of an increase might take them over. This little grain of salt is correct. The argument they make based on that is silly, which is the nicest word I could think of. And let's see how and why that is. First, you have to look at all the effects of raising a minimum wage. The only effect isn't some employer is going to say, I'm not going to hire workers if they cost me that much. That is one effect. Here's another one. Millions of workers will have more money in their pocket when you raise the minimum wage. Millions. First of all, there are the millions who are at the bottom and who are going to go up. But millions more have their wages pegged to the minimum wage. In other words, the wage you get in a particular line of work is 20% more than the minimum wage. So if the minimum wage goes up and they want to keep that peg, they go up too, and there's plenty. So we know that 10, 20 million American workers are going to have more money in their pocket. Guess what they're going to do, since they're at the low end of the scale? They're going to spend the money. That's what people who earn more money do with it, especially if they haven't got a lot of it. They spend it. And that means a sudden, dramatic increase in purchasing goods and services by millions of people. And if you increase the demand for goods and services, you're going to create more jobs. So you'd have to weigh the impact of jobs lost by the marginal employer who decides not to hire or to hire less against all of the extra jobs created. Number two, the people who lose their jobs, if there are some, the people who lose their jobs at least have the comfort of knowing that the next job they get has to pay the new higher minimum wage. So they will have lost a job that wasn't paying very well, and they will, it may take a while, but they will eventually get a job that cannot pay them that little because that's no longer legal. And that's going to have all kinds of social effects. So if you really wanted to argue and you weren't a hustler, a paid spokesperson for Wendy's or something like that, then you would have to say, to be against it, you'd have to weigh the likely number of people to lose their job when the minimum wage goes up against all the people who will now get a job or get a better job because of all the positive effects that come from raising the minimum wage. There have been people who've done that work, and guess what? The number of people who lose their job, we have some examples around the country, the number of people who lose their jobs is always a small fraction of the number of people whose situation is improved, both in terms of having a job and in terms of having an income from that job. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons why all the other advanced industrial countries have a higher minimum wage, because their people figured it out, and their people don't permit employers to do what Wendy's would like to be able to do here. Last point. In the video, if you go to the internet and look at this story in the Wall Street Journal on Wendy's, you can all find it. In the video that goes with the story on their website, there's an official of Wendy's and a couple of Fox News reporters. I believe they were Fox. Maybe they worked for Wall Street Journal. I should be careful. I'm not 100% sure. One or the other. It probably doesn't make much difference, but in any case, one or the other. They waxed. It was really charming. I mean, it was one. The two of them said, you know, this we're not talking about big companies. The implication being to jack up the minimum wage when you're employed by a big company, well, that might be okay. We all hate big companies. But, they said with great intensity, it isn't big companies. It's franchisees. If you know how many businesses like fast food work, there is a parent Wendy's Corporation, but the actual Wendy's restaurant you go into, if you do that, is owned by somebody, typically a person who owns between 1 and 5 of these little places, and who is a franchisee. That is, they buy all the stuff you buy from the parent Wendy's Corporation, the hamburgers, the wrapping, the plastic, all that. They buy it and effectively resell it to you, and they charge more than they pay Wendy's for it. And this is a very good deal because it's like a pyramid scheme. You know, that's what this is. We don't call it that because we're polite. So I'll just say it's like a pyramid scheme. So they were saying it's hurting. This is wonderful. It's hurting the franchisees. Again, Wendy's, who rips these franchisees off 12 ways to Sunday, every chance they get, was suddenly concerned about the franchisee. They're going to have a harder time paying these higher wages. It's going to be hard for them. To which, of course, the only answer, if you're not befuddled by this nonsense, the only answer is, gee, Wendy's, if your franchisees are having a hard time, help them out. give them a better deal on the plastic. Sell that 400-year-old sick cow that you have just killed for this hamburger at a lower price, and that'll help the franchisee pay the wages. What are you coming here? You want to help the franchisee by screwing the people the franchisee employs. How nice. You just don't want to pay anything yourself. There's the bottom line. That's what all of this is about. The minimum wage increase helps a lot of people, hurts some, no question. Every law ever passed, if you do the economics, helps some people and hurts others. The minute you hear a political leader tell you this is a win-win situation, do not buy a used car from that person because it will only drive backwards. Okay? There is no such a thing. That is a fantasy. It's like getting a perpetual motion machine or imagining that if you buy enough tickets in the lottery, you too will be a billionaire. Okay. So much for the Wendy's. In order to make sure that I am not understood to be the purveyor of bad news all the time, I wanted to give you, let's call it mixed news. I was sent this by, I think, one of you here, but maybe a person who listens to the radio, because I don't normally read the following magazine, Electrical Construction and Maintenance. And my guess is that most of you also do not read this magazine unless you're in that business. Anyway, the July issue, it's a monthly magazine, July issue, has a very good story, which is why this person obviously sent it to me, about something called wage theft. Wage theft. Basically what this is employers who take advantage of the fact that their employees don't know exactly what the laws are governing what has to be paid to them, and so pay them less than they're legally required to pay them. And this is a serious problem in the electrical construction business, as I'm sure it is in quite a few businesses. And so this magazine, which is a magazine for the industry, for this industry, had a very good story about it. The Harris Electric Company, which has been doing this for years, but because of a few workers who informed themselves, were angry at what was happening to them, asked enough questions, figured out that they were being underpaid, went through a long struggle, took 2 or 3 years, but when they finally won, as they did, they got a lot of back pay because it had accumulated over many months. So they got a nice lump. And in order to drive the point home, the magazine goes over 4 examples of where this happened, and made me feel so good. I thought I'd give it to you so you could appreciate it too. So first here, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, an enterprise known as Cavallo and Cavallo, but doing business as Beaumont Solar Company. The owner, Philip Cavallo, had to pay $83,000 in restitution, $42,500 in penalties for the workers that he had underpaid, that he had simply not paid what they were legally entitled to. In Honolulu, Lighting Services Incorporated lost its court case and had to pay workers $1.2 million in back wages. A total of 38 people shared $1.2 million. Not bad. Now, they had to wait a while, and they had to fight a long time, but they got something. U.S. Department of Labor, pressed by workers, filed a lawsuit against LRE, Royal Electric Contractors, and they got $345,000 from George Smith, the owner, to cover the back wages of 61 electrical workers. And finally, here in New York City, Ronald Bartiromo and Raymond Doria didn't pay electricians about $250,000 that they were supposed to on 2 New York City projects. And when the dust settled, they had to come up with $274,000 to pay those people. So you don't always lose. The lesson is if you fight back and you get together with other people, you can. which is a lesson that the next couple stories maybe will give us a way to concretize. Since our last meeting, we've had the announced Chapter 11 bankruptcy of the A&P supermarket chain. So if you grew up, as I did, with A&P being like a major place where everybody went to shop, you can't do that anymore. I assume many of you know that A&P its reputation has been sliding for decades. One of the ways they tried to deal with that was by changing their name to things like Food Emporium and so forth, but it's all the same company. At the time of their going out of business this last week, I believe it was, they had, I just want to get the numbers for you, 300 supermarkets, beer and wine stores still that they were operating. They employed 28,500 workers. That's a lot of people. This is the second bankruptcy in 5 years. This is like flunking out of kindergarten 3 times in a 6-month period. It ought to send up a flag, something's wrong. It shouldn't happen to you like this. Over the last 4 years ago, or it may have been 4 or 5 years ago, was their last bankruptcy. As part of that bankruptcy, they got a number of concessions from their workers. One of the things you get is if you go out of business, you're bankrupt, you can turn to your workers and say, well, I mean, we only have 2 choices now. We're bankrupt. We can either close the business and you have no job at all, or you can agree to work at lower wages, less benefits, give up your pension, forget your vacation, try to have lunch in 4.5 minutes, et cetera, and then you get to keep your job. It's a frequent blackmail, it's really no other way to say it, in which the employer says, I can hurt you badly or I can hurt you very badly, which would you prefer? And most workers raise their hand, puzzled after a few minutes, I prefer badly. Because it's not as bad as the other thing you just said. So once again, A&P took advantage, as companies often do. Not only did they get concessions 5 years ago when they went bankrupt, but one of them was no wage increase for the next 4 or 5 years. So those workers gave up a wage increase for 4 or 5 years to hold on to the jobs which they're now going to lose. If I had time and if there was more of a spirit in the room, I'd stop and we'd just play the national anthem. Just to let the full weight of this patriotic behavior settle in. They are selling about 120 stores to other supermarkets who will fold them in to what they're already doing or expand what they're doing. Many of these, thousands of these people will lose their jobs in any case. What all else they will lose, what vested interest they had, what pension, who knows? It's a disaster. As the heads of the union, these are unionized workers, many of them, said, it's amazing to them why they would go bankrupt because the competing supermarkets, Stop and Shop and some of the other ones that you're familiar with, didn't have a concession 5 years ago, didn't go bankrupt, and have been raising their wages and are still profitable, but this company, which didn't have to raise wages for 5 years, can't make a go of it. That smells like the people running it either don't know how to do that or maybe never wanted to. Maybe this is a way of paying a bunch of people some nice salaries and dividends and stuff and winding the business down without letting anybody know and keeping those 28,000 families hoping against hope that they're not going to be getting what they now got. Why do I bring it up? It's a sad story. It's repeated often in this country, and it has been for 50 years. One of the reasons I bring it up is to ask you to think about an alternative that not a single newspaper story, and I really did the research to see how this story about A&P going bankrupt, how it was being handled in lots of different media. Nobody raised this question. What would it mean if A&P were run not as a capitalist corporation, but as a collective, a cooperative of all the workers that work there? That would have meant 5 years ago that you didn't give a concession as a worker and then hope that the management would not screw you, which they have now done. It would have meant you want us to forego a vacation and a wage increase and a vacation and a all right, we'll take a hit. But we're going to run this company now to make sure that what we're giving up is used in the proper way to rebuild this enterprise and make our jobs secure. A worker co-op would never give up all these conditions and get essentially nothing. You gave up, and what you got were no wage increases for 5 years and then another collapse. The people who brought you the first collapse, who got from you a concession, have now finished the job by giving you a collapse again. Folks, for the workers to have taken over that enterprise, they couldn't have done worse than this anyway. They couldn't have. Meanwhile, their fate would have been in their own hands. They would have had a chance. They might have found help. They might even, heaven knows, turn to the larger community and say, you know, if you don't really care whether you get your Rice Krispies in store A or store B, why don't you do us a favor and come to our store, because we're a worker co-op, and if you believe in that, you'll buy from us to help us make a good living, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It would be a better strategy to survive than trusting, in a sense, trusting a capitalist enterprise not to do what they so often do. So the last short one before we go into the major topics. This last month, there was an important economic event, but it didn't take place among economics people. It took place among psychologists. The American Psychological Association had its annual meeting. And this is an interesting organization of psychologists and all of that around the country. It's the official organization of psychologists. Yeah, we have a fly convention here this evening. Not just me, they're flying around everybody here. So there was a story in the Chronicle of Higher Education which caught my eye about the convention of the American Psychological Association. That association had commissioned a report by a lawyer in Chicago, name of Hoffman. And this was a report by the lawyer looking into the problem that had been brought up by a large group of psychologists, saying that they were very upset to learn that their fellow psychologists had worked with the United States military to design and administer torture. This lawyer did his research and gave his reports, all this the last few weeks. And in this report said, yes, indeed, that this had happened. How it had happened, when it had happened, documented the whole story. Well, the psychologists' argument went something like this. And this was the argument that prevailed at their conference. They voted on this. That they think of themselves like doctors of a sort, mental doctors, if you like, and that therefore they take seriously the Hippocratic Oath, the famous oath that healers are supposed to take, whose first line is often, do no harm. In other words, whatever else you do, never hurt or make worse the medical condition that's brought to you by a person who's in pain or suffering. It's kind of the iron first rule. And that if you took that rule seriously, which you're kind of supposed to, as a basic ethical commitment of a healer, someone in a healing profession, you couldn't square that with designing and administering torture to people, which is what they did. So they've apologized to the world. You can follow all that if you're interested. Look, APA, American Psychological Association. Why do I bring this up? Well, I want to tell you, as an economist, about another way that psychologists are very active in the economy all the time, in a way that raises very similar ethical problems. What is that? One of the largest industries in a modern capitalist economy is called advertising. Advertising is an industry that works as follows. You have something to sell, a car, a radio, a piece of clothing, whatever, and you want to sell more of whatever it is you make than you otherwise might. You then go to an advertising company to get them to develop for you posters, flyers, radio ads, TV programs, whatever, that will get people to buy more of whatever the hell it is you produce than they otherwise might. And long ago, companies looking to sell more of whatever they produce, by the way, do they want to sell more in order to help you? Okay, I don't need to answer the question. Do they want to sell more because they've done a lot of research and it's clear to them you will be better off if you have purchased more of this than if you haven't? Okay, I don't need to answer that either. They are doing that, these corporations. They're trying to find ways to sell more because they make more profit doing that. And any one of them who's honest, and there are plenty who are, will tell you that, often with great pride, that they are driven by profit. So what does the advertising industry do? Years ago, they understood the way to get people to buy more is to associate the purchase of whatever it is with deep underlying psychological needs, anxieties, fears, worries. You might have thought you're a nice-looking person, but you are uglier than cement. But if you use this hair cream, all of that will be overcome, and the world will think of you as the beauty you could be if you buy what we sell. Now, we're so used to this, we're so used to it that we kind of tune it out or don't recognize it or just deal with it as part of the noise in the larger society, or we giggle over it. But in point of fact, as countless people can tell you, and I'm sure you've all thought of it yourself, when you have a society that systematically studies, cultivates your fears and anxieties, it's going to affect you, friend. It's going to rev up your worries way beyond what they otherwise were. You're going to be fat. Ugh. Or you're going to be too tall or not tall enough, or too sexy or not sexy enough. And it's terrible, and that's why people don't like you. You hadn't even thought about it. You thought people liked you, but you're being told they don't. Not enough. No, but you know, folks, this is serious. Think, the example was taught to me actually by my daughter. Young women are taught that it's very, very important to put heavy quantities of gook on their faces all the time, because their eyes, their cheeks, their hair isn't beautiful, isn't charming, it isn't enough. But this cream or that powder or this, if you buy enough of it, if you have enough different shades of it, if you use it in the right way and use it often enough, you can be more popular in high school than you now are, you poor thing you. This has lasting psychological effects. What are psychologists doing? Their job is to study our psychological lives and to help us. if we have problems in that area, to help us identify them and help us work through them. What are they doing selling underpants or soap or breakfast? What is this? This is an ethical abuse of people. It makes them unhappy and worried and anxiety-ridden, etc. This is doing harm, not doing good. And where is the prohibition? Advertising. Just remember, billions and billions of dollars are used in this society every year. Tens of thousands of creative people, artists, graphic designers, psychologists, people with skills that could be put to use in 100 useful ways, are busy decorating the can of soup so that you buy this brand of soup because of the lovely picture of carrots that are on it, as opposed to beans that the other one. This is a capitalist efficiency. It's the opposite. It is a colossal waste. And the minute one producer advertises what he produces, it immediately forces all of the others, even if they hadn't wanted to do it on their own, they now have to do it, or else the customer will all go to the one that's got this. So if one car company drapes a three-quarter naked woman on the fender in the hopes that the man who wants to buy the car imagines in his befuddled brain that if he buys the car, he's going to get her. That means that the next car company has to have somebody on their fender. It's a disease that necessarily replicates. It's like a cancer. And it's a colossal waste of energy, of time, of space, of resources. It's a very strange economy. The alternative, of course, would be that we have a system, especially using the internet, of informing the public of what the products are that are available. Here's a description produced by a neutral who's not trying to sell one or the other. Here they are. Some of you know the magazine Consumer Reports. It basically does that. You could have that done in a proper way for everybody, and when you're interested in buying something, you go on this place on the internet and you get the description of the 10 different kinds, and you go make your choice. Then we would free up billions of dollars, could be doing other things, making our community 50 times better for us than inundating us with an endless series of thinly disguised lies and psychological manipulations. It's not an efficient economic system that does that. And the United States does more advertising than any culture on this planet. We are the leaders. It was invented here. If you're ever interested, Benson and Bowles was the first, Benton, and Bowles, back in the 1920s, that begins this. And there's a professor, Stuart Ewan, who teaches at the Layman School, and he has a book, if you're interested, it's a book written about 20 years ago called Captains of Consciousness. It's a book about a study of the history of advertising in the United States. Read it, and it will tell you all you ever need to know, plus about it. All right, let's turn then to the topics that we were going to spend time on tonight. First, Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico. Why is Puerto Rico on the agenda? Not the map. The agenda for tonight. Puerto Rico, to make the long story short, Puerto Rico is to the United States what Greece is to Germany. It's our Greece. And we are killing it. I mean, literally, economically, wrecking that place. We've been doing it for a long time. Just to remind you, Puerto Rico is a colonial territory. We had a war with Spain 115 years ago. The Spanish lost. We, the U.S., won. And we took from them that place and made it one of ours. This was a time when the United States was thinking seriously of becoming a colonial power like Britain and France and Germany and Belgium. And this was going to be one of our first ones. The Philippines was another one, and so on. But Puerto Rico, and so it's been this funny thing We don't call it a colony. We're Americans. We never want to call something with a name that sounds like it's not good. So we don't have any more bus drivers, as I've told you. We only have transportation engineers. It's a way to make a bus driver feel much better. You can cut his salary and raise his title, and maybe he'll go for that. You can kind of always hope. So Puerto Rico is a commonwealth. What? Yeah, exactly. A commonwealth. The minute you go to Puerto Rico, you'll realize that the welfare is not held in common. So whatever that word means, it doesn't mean what the English language would normally make you assume it meant. Nothing of the sort. It means we own it, but it isn't a state. We don't let it be a state. And so it isn't a state. It's a thing. Let me give you some facts about it. Per capita income of Puerto Rico. I'm going to compare it with the state of Mississippi. The state of Mississippi is in a constant contest with the state of New Mexico. And the issue is, which of them is the poorest state out of the 50 in the United States? And it goes up and down. Some years New Mexico wins, if that's the word you want to use, and other years Mississippi wins. Per capita income in Puerto Rico is half that of Mississippi. Okay? Let me do that again. The per capita income of Puerto Rico is half of Mississippi. The jobless rate, the official unemployment rate in Puerto Rico today is 12.6%. In the United States, among the 50 states, the state with the highest unemployment rate is West Virginia, which has 7.4%. So Puerto Rico has the highest unemployment. Puerto Rico's labor participation rate, that's the proportion of adults who are either working or looking for a job. In the United States, the 50 states, it's around 63, 64%. So a little less than 2/3 of our adults are either working or looking for a job. 1/3 of them are, we don't quite know. They're in institutions, that's a polite way of saying jail, military, and they're just out there, and they don't have a job, but they're not looking anymore, they've given up. Or they're working in a kind of work where it's very important when they ask you questions to mumble something, because you're not going to tell them how it is you actually earn your income, because then you'll get arrested. And we have an enormous number of those, but we pretend we don't. It's very American. Okay. Labor force participation rate in the United States, I say 63%. Labor force participation in Puerto Rico, 43%. 20% less of the people are either working or looking for a job. They're just there. And of course, if you're not in the labor force, and the majority of Puerto Rican adults are not, that's what this means, 43% means that 57% are not in the labor force, those people eat. And those people wear clothes, and those people live in an abode. But they don't work to produce anything, which means the other people who are working have to produce what they consume, because they are consumers who aren't producers. What? Yes, or they're living off the land. That's possible. There will be some who are not counted. That's correct. Who are, in fact, producing something in some way to help themselves live. But they would have to be picking fruits in a place where no one cares that they're pulling the fruits off the tree. That may be possible. Okay. The official poverty rate in the United States is 15%. The official poverty rate in Puerto Rico is 45%. The median household income, I'll stop after this because you're going to get the picture. The median household income, that's the level of income where 50% make more and 50% make less. Median household income is $7,000 a year less than Detroit, Michigan, which is the worst off major American city we have. So you get clear the picture. Puerto Rico is an economic disaster. and it has been deteriorating at least the last 12 to 15 years. That's important. Before this crisis of 2008 hit, they were already in trouble and going down. Okay, what are the conditions for this? Well, there are several. It's a poor agrarian country. It has been under the control of the United States for over a century, 117 years to be exact. We've had, therefore, plenty of time to come up with plans, to find ways of funding plans, to develop agriculture, because it's a very warm and rich soil place, and industry. It is located in the middle of the space between North and South America, and on the route to Europe and Africa and shipping. So it's well placed, it's got a lot of good conditions. What's going on here? Well, a number of things. First, the United States at various points in its history has had labor shortages. And those labor shortages meant that if you didn't find a new source of labor, you would have to raise wages, because the only way an employer could get more workers, if things were going well, if everybody was already working, would be to convince a worker to leave wherever he or she was to come over and work for you, and the way you do that is offer them more money. So if you run out of workers, then the competition among employers drives up the wages. This, of course, is very nice news for the workers, but not so good for the employers. And so what employers like to do when that situation is either here or threatening to come here is the employers like to get new workers to come in so they don't get into this situation where they're bidding against each other for a scarce worker supply. How do you get new workers? Well, there's always several ways. Here's one way. This was very popular in the 1970s. You convince a part of the population that wasn't coming to work that they ought to do so. Who was it in the 1970s and 80s that played that role here in the United States? Women. Women had a liberation movement. That is, there were plenty of women who meant liberation exactly as the word is implied. But there were plenty of other women who, whether they understood it or not, redefined liberation, so it meant going out of whatever the non-liberation was in the household and getting the different kind of non-liberation you get in the workplace. Instead of calling that from one kind of enslavement to another, this was called liberation until you got there and discovered it isn't. But you could solve the problem by, and we did. Millions of adult women, particularly white adult women, moved into paid labor who hadn't done it before. Earlier in the 50s and 60s, which was always also a time of great growth in the United States and very low unemployment, there was a fear again. And in those days, we turned to Puerto Rico. And coming to New York City particularly, but also to other urban areas, was a wave of Puerto Ricans who could come because as a colonial country, they had free movement. They weren't considered immigrants the way someone, say, from Guatemala or Nicaragua or Mexico was and is, because they were inside the political boundary. So we've used Puerto Rico as a place to draw immigrants. So here's a little lesson in economics for you. Who are the people who usually come as immigrants? They're usually young men and young women, older than teenagers, or at least late teenagers, 20s, 30s. These are your most productive citizens. They're the people whom you spent a lot of money on putting them through school, teaching them a whole lot of things, reading, writing, skills. So Puerto Rico spends money it doesn't have to educate young people, to get them to the point where they're productive, and they leave. And they give their productivity to to New York City. This is not economic development. This is economic underdevelopment. You are undermining the economic, you're removing the people with the best capacity to develop your economy. In every which way, they leave. The United States gets the benefit. The United States gets it didn't pay, the United States didn't pay for their education, but gets their productivity. It's, by the way, true of all immigrants. And it's a serious problem. And the next time you hear about, we're helping the immigrants, stop. Are there ways that the United States helps an immigrant? Sure. But there are also very important economic ways that an immigrant who comes here is doing the United States a colossal favor. All the cost of training and building that worker have been borne elsewhere. And all the benefits of his or her productivity are realized here. That is a staggering fact, which is why all advanced industrial countries, sooner or later, use immigration to help their own development. That's why there are the immigrant communities in Sweden, in Norway, in Netherlands, in Italy, in Spain, in Germany, fill in the blank. The only difference is where the particular immigrants come from. So in Germany, it's all Turkish, I mean, not all, but heavily Turkish, whereas in France, it's North Africa, et cetera, et cetera. We have Puerto Ricans. But it means that the economy there can often not get off the ground because it can't count on anything. Any young person encountering any problem in his or her life can get up and leave, leaving behind what? A family with no one to support them. A family that then has to go on public assistance because it can't manage having had the young, creative, energetic folks go to the mainland, as they say there. Number one. Number two. For a while, the United States faced a problem in the 50s and 60s. Some of you ever studied the history. There were a group of Puerto Rican political people who were agitating for independence. They understood themselves to be a colony of the United States. And in the period of the late 40s and 50s, when colonies all over Africa, for example, were rebelling and breaking away from England or France or whoever was their colonial master, there was a movement for Puerto Rican independence, and it became quite strong. And the United States government reacted to that, as it always does to those threats. It says over and over again, we will not be affected. We don't care. Well, the minute they say that, that's when they're planning how best to cope. Don't ever take that serious. It's like saying, we don't care that there are demonstrations. That's when you know they're scared to death when they talk like that. So what did they do? They passed some laws that basically gave to Puerto Rico two benefits that were supposed to help them. Basically, tax deals. You didn't have to pay taxes of all kinds if you were a business in Puerto Rico. And secondly, if you lent money to the Puerto Rican government, the income you got from lending them money would not have to pay taxes here in the United States. Puerto Rican debt became what we call municipal debt. So if you're a rich American, you would lend money to the Puerto Rican government, you'd get your 4 or 5%, whatever it is, for the loan, but there'd be no tax. You wouldn't have, if you lived in New York, for example, you don't have to pay federal tax on that interest, you don't have to pay New York state tax, and you do not have to pay New York City tax. You don't pay anything. So if you're a millionaire and you have millions of dollars that you lend to Puerto Rico and you get, say, I don't know, $500,000 a year interest, that's yours, every nickel. There's not 1 cent of taxes. You all pay taxes on your wages, but if you're rich enough to lend to Puerto Rico, you pay nada, zilch, zero. Why was this done? The idea was Americans would lend to the Puerto Ricans and to the Puerto Rican government, and it would develop the economy. And by the same token, by manipulating the the tax laws, American companies would go and locate down there to take advantage of the fact they didn't have to pay taxes. And one industry did, but only one: pharmaceuticals. Suddenly, all over Puerto Rico, factories sprung up with all the familiar names of the big drug companies in the United States, and they produced drugs there, and they made a ton of money, which they didn't have to pay taxes on. But of course, if they don't pay taxes on it, then the Puerto Rican government doesn't get the taxes it would need to do anything. Oh, hadn't thought of that. Oh, well, the government's okay because it can borrow in the United States from Americans who don't want to pay any taxes. So that's how we'll do it. The pharmaceutical companies will go in there, which they did, make a ton of money, which they did, and take their profits, as companies do, and bring them back to New York. What are they going to do with them in Puerto Rico? They're not going to invest there. That's a poor place. They're going to invest in whatever their big business is. It's not Puerto Rico. So Puerto Ricans would make a lot of money for the company, but the money would leave, just like young Puerto Ricans left. So all that Puerto Rico could do to function was to borrow a lot of money, which they did. And Americans loved lending because they don't have to pay any taxes on the interest. This is great. So Puerto Rico borrowed, and it didn't do anything for its economy. And that all came to an end last week. Because last week, the government of Puerto Rico, for the first time, didn't pay part of its debts. Because it can't. What does that mean, it can't? It means the following. There's no way for the government of Puerto Rico to begin to pay what it now owns, by the way, $72 billion, with a B, $72 billion of debt. The only way they can pay what they owe, which is the interest and, paying back a part of the principal, would be if they close the schools, and close the hospitals, stop fixing the roads, and use that money saved on all those things to pay their debts, which will do what in Puerto Rico? Take the disastrous economic conditions I described to you 10 minutes ago and make them worse. That's exactly what's now being planned. A group of hedge funds, here's what they did. As it became clear over the last year or so that the Puerto Ricans could never pay their debts, any more than the Greeks can pay their debts. They've been badly hurt by 12 years of decline. Then the crisis that hit in 2008 made it worse. They can't. As it became clear, people holding the debt began, particularly those who pay attention, began to say, holiday is over, we got to get rid of these bonds because they may not pay interest, and that's not very good because if they don't pay interest, the fact that we don't have to pay taxes won't make a big difference because we don't get anything to not pay taxes on. So they began unloading these bonds. People got scared. Banks, pension funds, everybody sold the bond. And who bought the bonds? At first, nobody. Why would you buy a bond of a society that's going into the toilet and is telling you, doesn't look like we can pay? There's always somebody who will buy these bonds. These are called hedge funds who buy, you'll love the language if you're not familiar with it, distressed bonds. If you're a hedge fund that specializes in distressed bonds, that is the bonds of entities that look like they can't pay, you get a new name. You are called a vulture fund. I didn't make this up, friend. I don't have the imagination. Wall Street made this up. Vulture funds, they're called. And vulture funds have been buying up Puerto Rican debt. The debts of the government, say something listed as a $100 debt of the government, you can now buy from Puerto Rican, you can buy it for $20. Well, a speculator says, gee, I can get this debt of Puerto Rico, which says they have to pay $100. I only have to pay 20. If I can get even 50, if I can cut a deal with Puerto Rico to pay just 50 of what they owe, I will have paid 20, I'll get 50. I've done real well. So these vulture funds are now, they now own about a third of all of Puerto Rico's debts. They've been buying them up. And they want to get paid. And they are now working on the Republican candidates for president and the Democratic candidates. They're working to make sure that, here's their proposals. By the way, if you read the financial press, which I urge you to do, all of this is laid out. Nobody's hiding anything. They don't think they need to. That's changing now in the United States, but they haven't figured that out yet. So if you go in the financial press, they have a proposal. They all got together, the vulture funds. Ready? Lay off 28,000 teachers in public schools in Puerto Rico. Cut drastically the funding of the University of Puerto Rico, their institution of higher ed. Close thousands of schools. When we want to get paid. So they become a powerful interest group inside the United States to shape the official policy to make a killing off of the bonds they bought that took advantage of the decline of the people of Puerto Rico, which has what consequence? People leaving Puerto Rico is now going up. Of course. There are no jobs, there are no schools, they don't know how big. They're leaving, which makes the problem. This is exactly what's happening in Greece. By the way, Greece is hemorrhaging young people. They're leaving Greece in huge numbers, as periodically Greek young people have done for 200 years. That's how we have the Greek communities in many parts of the world, including the United States. They came, particularly at various moments when the Greek economy was in trouble. They're leaving again, which of course makes the Greek economy even worse. And believe me, if you're a young Greek person and you're arriving here in the United States, you've got to be desperate. There are no jobs here either. Must be really bad where you're coming from. Otherwise, what are you doing coming here? Get yourself a tremendous job, I don't know, at Wendy's. Absolutely, at Wendy's. So we have what? We have a society, Puerto Rico, millions of people, friends, millions of people, part of the United States, although in this particular sort of strange way, and we're not doing well by them. And so you got really kind of two choices as a human being and as a citizen of the United States. You either decide this is a failure of an economic system to plan out, to have some reasonable distribution of whatever the benefits of this economic system are, or you blame those people. That's your option. You either blame the system or you blame the Puerto Ricans. You all know, through your own personal life, that you're surrounded by people who go one way or the other on that subject. I hope there aren't too many who go the latter way, but it's a popular way because, you know, confronting that it's a system that doesn't work, that it's a system. Look, Mississippi and New Mexico have been our poorest states for 100 years. We haven't solved that problem. Our system can't solve the problem, which is why it hasn't solved the problem. And Puerto Rico is poorer than both of them. And it's been that way a long time. In Mississippi, maybe you could blame African Americans. In New Mexico, can't go that route. Oh, but you can maybe blame Native Americans. There's a lot of them in New Mexico. And in Puerto Rico, there are lots of Puerto Ricans, which makes a certain sense. So you always have somebody, you can make the fall guy here, the blame object. But blame is a different process than understanding something. You've noticed that in your own life. Sometimes when it's scary to understand something, you substitute blaming somebody, right? That's an easy option. But the point is, if you want to understand it, then this is a system confronted by grotesque inequality from one region to the next, complains about it, moans about it, but can't do anything about it. Just sits there like it's the rain that happens. And you know, what do you shake your fist at the sky? No, I mean, the rain happens. So Mississippi, for some reason, has got to be poor. New Mexico has got to be poor. Puerto Rico has got, for 100 years? By the way, the United States sends more money to Mississippi and New Mexico than we get from them in taxes. We have a system, unlike the Europeans who don't want to do it, we have a system in which the richer parts of the United States send money to the poor. There's a net flow that way. But it hasn't been enough, and it hasn't gone together with other measures that could solve the problem. It's a little bit like this system's failure to deal with the cycles. Every 3 to 7 years, we have a business cycle. Millions of people are thrown out of work. Factories stop, stores stop. You know, if you walk along 6th Avenue, you know, every third store is empty and it sits there for months. And then after sometimes a few months, sometimes a few years, we get back going again. And then it goes for a minute, boom. You know, that's unstable. That's instability. If you lived with a person as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago or insisted that your roommate get help. So why do you accept an economic system that is so unstable with such devastating consequences? If Mississippi even got itself going, which they have on occasion, then there'd be a downturn that would undercut the whole thing. Just like it happens to American families. They get going, they get a little savings, they have a job, then comes the next downturn that they didn't know, had nothing to do with, and just wipes it out from underneath them. You know who suffered the most in the subprime mortgage? It was millions and millions of poorer families who had these loans pushed on them. African American, Hispanic American, and poor whites, who lost their homes. They took the little bit of savings they had, they got into the house, they were told this was now going to work, that it wouldn't be that much more than they were paying rent, and they get a lot more space, and they'd be building up their own equity and all that story, and then they got wiped out. And we wonder why, whoa, you do that to a human being, what do you expect them? To have no effect, this undercutting of their efforts over 5 years? You're destroying your own people. But you're so blinded to the need for a systemic criticism that you can't go there. You're always looking for some explanation other than we're stuck with a system we should have gotten over long ago. So last thing, which is about these systems. I know you know that I talk a lot about worker co-ops, a way of organizing enterprises in which working people become their own bosses, that the board of directors is the collection of workers. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about the relationship between that idea and traditional socialism as we close for today. So first, traditional socialism. Socialism has been the other, the alternative to capitalism now for a good 150, 200 years. It's really truthful to say that with the rise of capitalism coming out of feudalism, starting in England back in the 18th century, spreading to Europe, North America, Japan, that in that period of time, capitalism always had critics, people who didn't like it. And that's not unique to capitalism. All systems, they have people who love it and people who don't. Feudalism had its critics, slavery had its critics, ancient Rome and Greece had its critics. You know, we study them, we read them. So capitalism always had its critics. And the school of critics, there were always a variety of them, but a school of critics that became the dominant critical school called themselves socialists. Why? Well, capitalism always struck people coming out of feudalism as supremely individualist. Everything was focused on the individual who starts a little business and becomes wealthy and gets profits out of employing other people. But it's a celebration of what the individual can do with the help of employees. And the critics always thought letting each individual do that produced for the community as a whole bad outcome. So the alternative, the critic of capitalism, called themselves something that reflected we're not about individuals rising. We're about the whole community rising together. We're about social progress, not individual progress. That is, the individuals being part of the community, we help each other. We produce the rising tide that lifts all the boats. So we are focused on the society as a whole, on the community as a whole, not on the individual. We are not individualists / capitalists. We are socialists. We are community focused. We are community. We are communists. It's all the same words. There's a reason for that. So the idea was society. And here's what it meant concretely in economics. And I promise I'll have this done in 5 minutes. Here's how it worked. The difference between capitalism and socialism got clearer in the 19th and 20th century. And here's what it went. In capitalism, enterprises, whether they be farms or stores or factories or offices, the ownership of them is private and individual. I own this thing. I own it, and I can tell you whether you have access to it or I can block you. I own the factory, whether it's through shares of stock or however it's done. I own. The socialist alternative is, no, you don't. We own. The ownership is collective. It's social. It's the community. We all own it. And, you know, socialists early on had fun with this. They said, you own the land. Because remember, in the 18th and 19th century, the most important productive asset was the land. Everybody depended on the land to grow what we eat and how we clothe ourselves. So how do you come to own the land, said the socialist. Did you put it there? No. Did you create the land? No. Then by what right, you arrogant bum, do you claim what God put there, or at least what you didn't put there, and you had nothing to do with it, and it's been growing, you know, with thousands of years of plants and animals going back into the soil. You just took what is everybody's. What is everybody? You took it for yourself. You were a mean, nasty person. So what is very important, the socialists played the ethics card. It's not an ethical arrangement. It's arrogant, it's selfish, it's inappropriate, it's against the Bible. I mean, the Bible says God put it all there. So who the hell are you, Jack? That was the first. So socialists said, we are for collective. The community as a whole owns it. And that's very important because it means that no person can ever withhold something the community needs to live. For example, the land. The community needs to have the land to grow the crops that we can all live. Private property, if it means anything, means that the owner of a piece of land can withhold what he owns from what the community needs. He can say, my piece of land, you can't grow anything on it. I'm going to be walking my dog on it, and I'm not going to pick up after the dog. It's not New York City, so I'm not going to do it. I have the right. I'm a private owner. I can withhold from the community what the community needs to survive. And the socialists said, this is immoral. This is outrageous. We're socialists. We're not this individualism gone mad. Second part. In capitalism, the way things move, resources, how they go from whoever owns them, whoever uses them. Likewise, products, how they get from the person who produces something, a loaf of bread, a shirt, a software program, to the person who consumes it and uses it. The mechanism for that, invented in part by capitalism, is the market. The way things go from producer to consumer is by a kind of bargaining, a negotiation. I'll give you 3 of my little green pieces of paper called $1, you give me the hot dog. It's a deal. And if you're not pleased with $3, you won't give me that hot dog. I'll have to give you $4 or something. We bargain. And the socialists said, this is even more disgusting than private property. It means that instead of us sharing what we all produce to make our lives better, we always intersperse a nasty activity whose whole purpose is to give you as little as possible while I get from you as much as I can. The market is a moment in which we are always conniving against one another. That's why for so many of you in this room, when you go in a store, you love the thing you're buying, but that moment when you have to give your wallet's contents hurts, because you know that in some way, if you were smarter or cleverer, or you'd gone to a different store, you might get that thing for $2 less. Everything is a struggle. Everything is an attempt to do better at the expense of the other. This produces discord, anger, resentment, hatred. This is the dumbest way to organize distribution. That's why the history of the world, we haven't done it that way most of the time. By the way, markets are not the normal way throughout the history of the human race that we've distributed goods. You do all know that. No, well, let me remind you. In all the millennia, when we lived in tribes and clans and other groups, distribution was handled as a community event. The chief of the tribe at the time of the harvest, he or she, if it was a woman, it was often women, she would distribute according to what people needed. If you had 6 children, you got more coconuts than if you had 2, because everybody knows that's reasonable. That's a, ready, socialist idea of how to do this. Or you had a group of elders who would sit down and they would decide, the older folks who'd been around and were supposedly wise, they would distribute it. We didn't have a bargain. I'm going to go here. How many of those will you give me if I give you 2? None of that. That was considered obscene and retrograde when it came in. So the socialists said we should go back and learn the history earlier and adapt it to modern conditions. Have planning. Plan it. We produce what we need as a community, and then we distribute it according to need. Just a footnote. During World War II, I think I've told you some of you this before. During World War II, the United States had this socialist moment. You know, it's a little bit like, I don't know, Bernie Sanders. It's a socialist moment. It's a weird little moment. What's happening? Here's what it was in World War II. We went to war. We're now at war with Germany and Japan and all of that. And it's clear that to fight that war, the United States is going to have to go over to Europe and to Asia and fight the war. And we're going to need the ships and the trains and huge amount of our resources to produce the guns and the ships and the planes and the tanks to fight a war. And that means a whole lot of resources here at home won't be available to produce the usual consumer goods that we as Americans are used to. The food, the clothing, the shelter, the automobiles, all the rest. Okay, so now we had a problem. There was going to be a scarcity of consumer goods because resources were being used for the war. Okay, you could have a market, the capitalist way. You could let the scarce food, clothing, and shelter be distributed according to who had the money to buy it. I've got some food. You're all hungry. Okay, what am I bid? Oh, you'll give me $2 for this bread? Nice. Anyone gonna give me 4? Oh, you'll give me 4? You know, mister, with the 2, you're screwed. Next. That's what markets do. So if we had allowed food, sugar, coffee, important things, if we had allowed the market to work, then the prices of those would have gone crazy. And here we go. Only the upper third of the American people could have afforded the things, which would have meant the majority of people would be told, we need your son to go and die over there, please, in a hurry, and we need you to starve. Sign up here. American people, our leaders thought, wouldn't buy that, wouldn't like it. And it would create real trouble in the country because rich people would be seen to be consuming what was left and everybody else would be screwed. And that was not the kind of unity you want if you're about to fight a world war. So the United States government said there will be no, you ready now? No distribution of products to the American working people by means of a market. The market is out. We're going to create, here's what we did as a nation, ration cards. The federal government printed up a card. Said, you know, this card entitles you to a quart of milk at the store, or a gallon of gas for your car, or a pound of meat, or a pound of sugar, or whatever. And when you went to the store, you had to have a ration card. Otherwise, you had $1 but no ration card, the store owner could not give you the milk. They'd go to jail, they'd be arrested. They're violating the law. And here comes the best part. How were the ration cards distributed? According to need. If you had a big family, you got a lot of milk. And if you didn't have a big family, you didn't get enough. From each according to each according to his need. Done by Joseph Stalin? No. By Franklin Roosevelt. That's who did that. And no Republican or Democratic opposition worthy of the name said boo. Couldn't say anything. Because when push came to shove, when metal hits the road, etc., the market, no good. Ethically impossible, practically unwanted. Too dangerous because, it divides us. Well, you know, friends, if it divides us in time of war, I got hot news for you. It divides us in time of peace, too. And if it isn't good to be divided in a time of war, what is it? Good to be divided in a time of peace? Not a smart move. Socialists were always community property and planned collective distribution rather than a market. But those two, here's the last point, those two were things that happen at the top of society. When the Russians made a revolution in 1917, you know what they did? They moved a lot of property from the private owners from whom it was taken, and they made it the property of the community as a whole to be managed by the state. They did one. And number two, they suppressed markets. They still had them, but they suppressed them, and on top of the market, they put a planning agency that did the basic distribution. So they did what they thought socialism was. What did that do at the base of society? In the industry, in the factory, in the office, in the store, where everybody works all day? I'm going to exaggerate, but not by much. It didn't change anything. The joke after the revolution was the workers went to work and went to the same factory and made whatever it was. And instead of being told what to do by the board of directors, elected by the shareholders, that was gone. There were no more shareholders. The government ran everything. So the government sent in officials, and they were the board of directors and told you what to do. But it wasn't you. So here's the new plan. In addition to public property, collective, social, community property, and in addition to a planned, ethical, community way of distribution, what you have to do, the mistake of traditional socialism, you have to transform the enterprise, the workplace. It has to become a place where the workers themselves, not a state official who's no better for this than having someone elected by a board of directors. You yourselves do it, because then the power in the end of that society is where it now is. The power in our society is in the business community. We all know it. We know who pulls the strings of our political leaders. It's the people with the money. If you want that to change, don't pass another law saying, you mustn't do that. They'll do it anyway. They always have. The way you get rid of it is to say, we don't anymore allow a small proportion of our people to have this crazy wealth, which they then use to keep the situation that way. We're going to make all industries owned and operated by all the workers who live in the area and who work in that place. They're the ones who will own and operate these enterprises, and they'll make sure that that government, as the agent of everybody, is really dependent on the base, because the base will have the property. That's why this interest in co-ops is beginning to become a national movement. It's a way of saying how to make socialism something new and different for the 21st century. It isn't about the state doing this and that. It's not enough to control and limit what the state can do so it doesn't become a new master. The power and the wealth have to be ground. It's the democracy coming to the enterprise, democracy coming to the economy. We've tried to build in this country for 200 years a political democracy on the basis of an economic autocracy. Everybody has a vote, but only a few people have all the money. And then we're surprised that the few people with all the money corrupt the effort to have a democratic system. You have to learn from that. Okay, we made a mistake. The solution to the mistake is to democratize the economy, and then we can have a democratic political system. And until we do that, we're spinning our wheels. We're voting for Tweedledum and Tweedledee, neither of whom talk about that. And one last thing, I'm not endorsing anybody or anything like that, but it is interesting, for the first time in a long time, that a person who is identified as a socialist can run, that he's getting extraordinary numbers of people coming out to his events, and that I think it's the third item on his platform is worker cooperatives, that he too is groping his way, his people, in a direction of the kinds of basic changes that address the system and the problems of this system and don't putter around at the edges when clearly we've done that, as we did in Puerto Rico for 117 years. By now it's time to say the traditional way of dealing with these problems failed. You have to, it's like going to an AA meeting. You have to begin by admitting you have a problem, because that's the first step if you're going to solve it. We have a problem, this system doesn't work, and that will be the first step to solving. Thank you very, very much.